Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our study of the book of Psalms. Today we're in Psalm 105. Now, last time we read this lengthy psalm. It's 45 verses in length, and there's a lot that is said about the history of God's relationship with the people of Israel. And so today what I want us to do is I want us to take several of those items, several of those things and pull them out and see what the point is that the psalmist is trying to make. And it really boils down to two different phrases, one at the beginning of the psalm and one at the end of the psalm, that really encapsulate what the psalmist is trying to help us with and what he's trying to focus on toward us. Let's look at a couple of things, because I think when we do, we really get the focus and the application of the psalm. First of all, in verse 5, in the first four verses, he talks about calling upon the name of the Lord and giving thanks to the Lord and singing to him and speaking of his wondrous works and all of these various things. And so then he says in verse 5, remember his marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. The call goes out to remember the things that God has done for Israel. And then for most of the psalm, you have this long laundry list of God's relationship with Israel. It goes back to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And then there's a discussion of Joseph and of Moses and Aaron and of the 10 plagues and all of these various things that God has done in taking care of his people and in watching out for his people, in protecting his people, in removing the obstacles from before his people. All of these various things are going to be a part of that call to remember the works of the Lord. Because the call has gone out to praise him. The call has gone out to be mindful of him and to talk about him and all of these various things. But why? Why does all of that matter? Well, because we have to remember who he is. And we have to acknowledge who he is and what he has done. There are many people today who will ask the question, why do we bother studying the Old Testament? Especially if Jesus came and he brought a new covenant, a new testament for us, and that's what we live under, and that's what we are called to obey today. Why does the Old Testament even matter? Because it helps us to remember. It helps us to remember who God is. It helps us to remember how God interacts with his people and what his cares are for his people and the lengths he will go to help his people. And so the Old Testament is very important because we need those accounts of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and the prophets, and on it goes, to help us to remember his works and to help us to come to a place of confidence and trust in who he is and what his relationship is with mankind. And so the first thing that you have in this psalm is this call to remember, and that's the overwhelming majority of the psalm. But then at the end of the psalm, there's another statement that's made down in verse 42. Because in verse 42 it says, "For he remembered his holy promises, and Abraham his servant. He brought out his people with joy, his chosen ones with gladness. He gave them the lands of the Gentiles, and they inherited the labor of the nations, that they might observe his statutes and keep his laws." On the one hand, at the beginning of the psalm, there is the call upon us to remember his works. But then at the end of the psalm, the psalmist is going to emphasize the fact that God remembered his promises. The emphasis of this particular psalm all centers around the nature of remembrance. That man has to remember God, who he is, what he has done, what his relationship is with him, what his expectations are of us. And yet at the same time, we also have to remember that God keeps his promises. That God remembers the promises that he has made, that God knows what he has promised to us, just as he knows what he has promised to those of generations before, and he will keep his promises. Not only are we to remember, but we are to also have the confidence and the trust that God remembers his promises as well. Therefore, when you look at the life of Abraham, which is specifically what is pointed out here, with the promises that God is going to give to Abraham back in the book of Genesis, that are going to be fulfilled through the remainder of Genesis and throughout Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and yes, Joshua as well. You see the promises of God, that God, even over the course of time, does not forget the promises that he has made, does not leave them by the wayside, but he remembers and he fulfills the promises that he has made. When you look at Psalm 105, it truly is this concept of remembering the deeds of the Lord and being obedient to him and serving him because the Lord remembers his promises to man. If we don't get anything else out of the psalm, that's what we need to get. Thank you for joining us today in our studies of Psalm 105. I hope that they have been beneficial to you. Next time, we'll come back and we'll begin looking at Psalm 106. Now, if you're watching these close to the time that they are put up, you need to recognize that there's going to be about a week's hiatus starting from today because there are some things in my schedule that are going to keep me from being able to post any for the next week or so. But we will come back in another week and we will begin looking at Psalm 106. I hope that you'll join us then. Thanks for watching today and have a great day.